Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Boozy History of, with me, your most gracious host, Ted. Welcome to Ted's Booze Cellar, the premier alcohol channel here on YouTube, and welcome to another episode of the Boozy History of, where I look at the history of different brewing types, beers, other alcohols, other brands, and other sort of histories of different parts of the brewing and alcohol world. And today we're going to be taking a look at the history, or at least a brief overview of the history of San Miguel, as well as also delving a little bit into the history of both the Spanish Empire and the wonderful nation that is the Philippines. This is a story that's wrought with corporate intrigue, dealing with conflict, taking business risks. It's got everything that an amazing story could want. It's even better than the 1992 hit Beastmaster 2 Portal Through Time.
Only thing a virgin is good for is sacrifice.
Well, I have sacrificed a few in my time too.
So, without further ado, and with a nice cold pint of San Miguel in hand, let's get on into the history of San Miguel. And to everyone at home, bottoms up. So, our story begins, as most historical epics do, with the birth of a great empire that would go on to achieve wonderful and magnificent things around the world, while also committing its fair share of absolutely abhorrent war crimes and general atrocities. And that is the Spanish Empire. And look, I'm not saying that the Spanish Empire was the only European supercontinental power of the day that committed war crimes. Quite frankly, as we've seen, the British, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Dutch, and definitely the Belgians in the Congo were more than capable of committing, a few no-nos, as we should call them. That being said, all the way up from the reunification of Spain to the Spanish-American War, the Spanish Empire was a massive force of political, naval, and military power throughout the world. And it was in the first couple of centuries of the Spanish Empire's expansion into becoming a global superpower that we come to the origins of our story. The Spanish came across the islands of the Philippines in 1521 when they sent out an expeditionary force led by Ferdinand Magellan. However, Spain's conquering of the Philippines wouldn't actually begin until 1565, when a force led by Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, I think, arrived in the Philippines during the reign of Philip II of Spain, who many would argue is Spain's greatest ever king. In the same year that they arrived, the Spanish also named the town of Cebu as the centre point of the Spanish government in the Philippines, and later in 1571 they moved it to its now current residence of Manila, which to this day is still the Philippines' capital. Now look, I'd like to go into the history of the Spanish Empire in a bit more detail, as well as the conquering of the Philippines that was enacted under Philip II's rule, but unfortunately we don't have enough time here, and it's not exactly relevant to the entirety of our story. That being said, if you guys do want me to do more in-depth videos on historical topics on, let's say my third channel, then do let me know in the comment section down below. However, it is worth noting that from the fall of Zaragoza in 1809 during the Peninsular War up to the Spanish-American War, the Spanish Empire did consistently just take L after L after L. I mean, we could go on forever. But where our story begins is in 1890, which saw the establishment of the first San Miguel brewery in Manila. In 1890 was the permission of the brewing of beer under Spanish rule in Manila. This in turn led to the establishment of the San Miguel brewery in Manila in 1890. So in a weird way, even though San Miguel is distinctly and definitively a Filipino beer, in a technical sense it's also kind of Spanish. Kind of. But even with that being said, I think if you look at the cultural impact of San Miguel today, it is clearly more definitively aligned with the Filipino identity than the Spanish one. And this all led to the brewing of the first San Miguel beer in 1890, which was San Miguel Pale Pilsen. I mean, it really is hard to understate how important San Miguel is to the alcohol industry in the Philippines. I mean, it genuinely is a match made in heaven, like, I don't know, Lampard and Drogba, or Henry and Bergkamp, or Novo and Pershaw, or Oh, think. Oh, I know! Dean Windass and Fraser Campbell at Hull. And even during these early years, San Miguel Pale Pilsen became so popular that it became known as the Pride of the Pacific at the Philippine Regional Exposition in 1895. However, it should be said that I couldn't find a huge amount of sources for this particular point, so I would recommend doing some research into it yourself. However, it does seem very likely that it would be true, because in 1913, a year before the First World War broke out, the brewery became incorporated for the first time, and later that year it also began exporting its produce to British-controlled Hong Kong. Then, in 1918, arguably the most important event in the company's history, at least from a boardroom perspective, happens when Andres Soriano y Rosas, I might have mispronounced that horribly, joined San Miguel, beginning the long-term and very, very, very much multi-generational family involvement of the Soriano family. Okay, so for this section we're just going to do a really quick lightning round of some of the general history around the brewery, and later renamed to the San Miguel Corporation, from the 1920s through to about the early 2000s. In 1922, the San Miguel Brewery expands into the world of soft drinks and non-alcoholic drinks by opening up the Royal Soft Drinks plant, also known as Royal True. In 1927, the San Miguel Brewery becomes the first non-US bottler and distributor of Coca-Cola. In 1963, the San Miguel Brewery is renamed to its modern-day name of the San Miguel Corporation. In 1983, we have a proxy fight of sorts in the Soriano family, which leads to the purchasing of a 47% stake over 2 instalments from Eduardo Cojuangco Jr. And if the editing there looked a bit choppy and chopped up, that's because, yes, I had to make sure I was going to pronounce it right. And then I still probably pronounced it wrong anyway. And he was actually associated with the then Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Now, we're going to get a bit more into the history of these two characters in the next couple of sections, so just bear with me on that. We'll get back to them in a second. In 1987, La Tondena Distillers are purchased by the San Miguel Corporation, who are then at that point in time the biggest distributors and makers of hard liquor in the Philippines. Then, in 1997, the San Miguel Corporation gives up its 70% stake in the Filipino branch of Coca-Cola bottlers for a 25% interest in the Australian company Coca-Cola Amatil Limited. In 2001, the Pure Foods Corporation is purchased by San Miguel and then somewhat unimaginatively renamed to San Miguel Pure Foods. In 2002, San Miguel acquired Cosmos Bottling Corporation. Later that same year, Kirin Brewing Incorporated buys a 15% share in San Miguel. And it is also worth noting that by 2001, San Miguel had grown to the point where it was producing 3.6% of the Philippines' entire domestic product and a whopping 4.5% of the government's tax revenue. I think when you look at the general history of the San Miguel Corporation, you would have to say that the 1980s were probably the most impactful on the at least modern boardroom and corporate level of the organisation. But at the same time, if you want to look at the history of the company as a whole, it's also worth noting the 1920s and the 2000s as well. Okay, so unfortunately the entirety of this video isn't going to be all ha-ha, funny ha-ha, because this next section is a little bit messed up and dark. It's not going to get too graphic, don't worry, but we are going to go over one of the more controversial rulerships, shall we call it, of a modern country in the mid-20th century. From 1965 through to 1986, the country of the Philippines was ruled under the presidency of Ferdinand Marcos. I say ruled under the presidency of because while he did rule as president, many, if not most people, would probably call him a dictator, to be honest. Now, I'm fully aware that the guy does have his supporters, but it does have to be acknowledged that, well, his reign, while characterised in the early years by economic growth, did have a bit of a, shall we say, complete lack, or mostly lack, of civil liberties. I mean, let's not forget the guy used repression tactics and violence against groups like communists, Muslims, political opponents, and even outright subjugated these groups. And he would also just use these tactics against innocent civilians as well. It's also worth noting, during Ferdinand's presidency, that he did also enact 9 years of martial law, all the way from 1972 up to 1981. He eventually was ousted in the People Power Revolution of 1986, which I do recommend reading up on. It's one of the more fascinating social revolutions, although it is worth noting that while, yes, he may have some supporters, it's hard to deny that the actions taken under his reign didn't have zero negative impact on the country. I mean, it was a deeply corrupt presidency, let's call it what it is, and he committed some truly atrocious things against his own people. It's also worth noting as well that he has claimed that he is the Philippines' most decorated war hero, but many military historians have since claimed that this is mostly bogus. Oh, and yeah, he's also a lawyer. Well, he trained to be a lawyer, but still. Now, before we get on to the real pièce de la résistance of this video, we do have to go over one more historical figure, but this will only take a couple of minutes. Eduardo Murphy Cojuangco Jr., also known as Danding, was a very complex political figure in the Philippines. He left behind a legacy that is, yeah, it's complex to say the very least. The guy does have his support in the Philippines, and he is remembered for being a very much achieved and well-storied businessman and politician. But it is also worth noting that he was also very heavily involved in the government of Ferdinand Marcos, and that, yeah, he was just a bit of a shady guy, so there's no real denying it, to be honest. It's not too far out of the imagination to imagine that someone who was associated with the Ferdinand Marcos government is themselves also a bit somewhat morally unscrupulous. But you might be asking, well, why are we all of a sudden focusing on Eduardo? I mean, sure, he was renowned as being one of the most powerful cronies in Ferdinand Marcos's government by many, many detractors, but why are we focusing on him in this story? Well, that's because of his involvement in the Cocoa Levy Fund controversy. What's that? Well, strap yourselves in for a fair bit of business talk, but this is the big one. Okay, so the Cocoa Levy Fund controversy. This is one of the biggest domestic controversies in Southeast Asia during the 80s and 70s, and for very, very good reason. The Cocoa Levy Fund controversy was in relation to funds that were deemed to have been misappropriated by the Marcos government that were from new levies that were levied on coconut farmers, and it was suspected that many of these funds were being funneled through Marcos and Cojuangco's own private investments. And when you look into the records that were released later on, after the regime fell, yeah, it's pretty clear that's exactly what happened. Now, this was particularly important because these funds were meant to be used to be funneled back for the coconut farmers to help with their profitability and their output. So it was definitely meant to be used to help the coconut industry in the long term. And this is really damaging and quite disheartening as well when you consider how important the coconut industry is to the Philippines. And to really put that into perspective, as recently as 2021, the FAO organisation calculated roughly that the Philippines was producing about 14.7 million tonnes of coconuts in that year alone. That is an absolutely astronomical amount. It was discovered through political leaks decades later that the funds used for the acquisition of the stakes that Cojuangco and the Filipino government had in San Miguel was levied, well, for lack of a better term, from the levies that were taken from the coconut industry and that were then funneled in through multiple investment formats into the stakes and shares of San Miguel. So the 47% stake that was acquired by the government was actually acquired in two different stages. The first 20% was purchased by Cojuangco by funds that were realised later on to have been windfalls from the Coconut Levy Fund. And then the other 27% appears to have come from the Coconut Industry Investment Fund Oil Mills Group, which, as I'm sure you're very surprised to hear, was also funded by windfalls and skim-offs from the Coconut Investment Fund. What a surprise! Thankfully, the funds that were acquired by the government were put under temporary lockdown control by the Presidential Commission on Good Government. As of April 2011, it was also confirmed as for definite that Cojuangco owns the initial 20% stake that the government had in San Miguel. But since the company had expanded in terms of its profitability and share prices, this had kind of reduced to about 17%. In September of 2012, it was confirmed by the Supreme Court of the Philippines that the 27% stake that was acquired by the government would be used to assist the productivity and the continual improvement of the coconut industry. But later in 2012, San Miguel bought back the government-owned shares for a price of about 57 billion pesos, which is pretty hefty amount. This whole timeline as well was wrought with controversy, not only because the funds were gained for the stakes in San Miguel that the government had through very, very illegitimate means, but that in of itself was a wider controversy that affected large other parts of Filipino industry and private investment groups. It's such a massive catastrophe on such a big scale that I do think it really heavily contributed to the people power revolution that occurred in 1986. At least I think it definitely aggravated or accelerated it to that point for sure. And also, let's be honest, it's a good thing that San Miguel do have their shares back, because in a government as corrupt as the Marcos government, I wouldn't like to see what that amount of money would have been used for. That's I think they would have probably run the brewery into the ground.
It's green.
Amazing. Okay, so before we finish off for the video, I do just want to touch on my closing thoughts for this story. I did find throughout my research that many Filipino writers were making reference to the hardiness, the spirit and the toughness of the Filipino people, and how they can ride out so many challenges and adversities and still come out fighting on the other side. And I feel in a way that that kind of spirit is kind of reflected in the history of the San Miguel Brewery / corporation. In reality, the San Miguel Brewery should not be around anymore, in the sense that it has faced so many adversities that you would have thought it would have crumbled many, many moons ago. But despite surviving through, the Great Depression, the economic fallout of World War One, the Second World War, the Coconut Investment Fund controversy, the Far East Asian economic market collapse in the 1990s, even through all of that, it is still standing tall as the Philippines' biggest distributor of beer, at least in terms of its popularity anyway, or at least in terms of its cultural relevance and popularity in that sense. But honestly, it is absolutely insane how much San Miguel has endured over the years. And not only that, but also how popular it is around the world. Even though it is quintessentially a Filipino beer, it is very much popular around the world, absolutely. I mean, I've got some right here. So you guys let me know in the comment section down below what you think about that, as well as what your thoughts have been on the multiple subject points throughout this video. Let me know in the comment section down below as well if you have any ideas for future episodes of Ted's Booze Cellar, video formats, video suggestions for a boozy history of, stuff like that. And on top of that, if you want to check out anything else I do online, I'll leave the links to all that in the video description down below. And as well as that, remember to leave a like, share and subscribe if you liked this video. And until next time, have fun, stay safe with whatever you're doing, don't do anything I wouldn't do, wash your hands, drink responsibly, know your limits, and I'll see you guys at the bar next time on Ted's Booze Cellar. Bye bye for now.